I'd like to introduce her talk, which has the title of Creative Disability and the Shaking Palsy, Approaching a History of Parkinson's Disease. Dorothy, thank you very much for coming to this conference.
Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here, and very interesting papers and conversation this afternoon. And I think that my discussion actually will tune in with some of the issues that the earlier speakers have raised. Now, although I've stolen James Parkinson's term of the shaking palsy for his description of the paralysis agitans in his 1817 volume. Sadly, I am not going to be talking about him, which is a great loss. And I hope that one day I will, in the book that this is a small part of, in the larger project, I will have a little bit of a chance to return to being a historian of the long 18th century Enlightenment. But I won't be doing that today. Today I'm concentrating more on the creative disability part of this title, and the reason for that is, and it's what well, there are a number of reasons why I started to work on the history of Parkinson's disease and stopped thinking about Marx Weber and the history of the state, and for a little while. But one of them was that I think I'm actually not an anthropologist. I'm actually not a professor of anthropology. I'm a professor of the history of science, history of health sciences. But I think that since human societies, or members of human societies, first did cave paintings in the caves of southern France and northern Spain 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, I think there is almost a universal value in all human societies that creativity is a transcendent experience, indeed a transcendental experience, a transformative experience in every human society, I think, until now. Ours, when it has become pathologized. And so that's sort of the thing that that's a very intriguing phenomenon for me, and that's what's been driving my research into this aspect of Parkinson's disease. And I can try and talk about the broader project if you want me to in discussion time. Okay, so let's get going. So Oliver Sacks, the great neurologist and great public intellectual, and in his account, in the film that's made of his 1973 account of waking up catatonic survivors of the encephalitis lethargic epidemic of the early 20th century. His great account in the book Awakenings, the film that's made of his book, which stars Robert De Niro and Robin Williams. There's a wonderfully poignant moment in that film, in Awakenings. I don't know how many of you have seen it, when Leonard Lowe, the central protagonist, played by Robert De Niro, he's on the brink of starting to return to his catatonic state, having been woken up with the massive doses of L-Dopa by Oliver Sacks. But there's a moment in the film when Robert De Niro dances with his amour, with his love interest Paula, and he loses in the moment of the dance. He loses all his symptoms of Parkinsonism. His movements are fluid, and he loses all his retropulsive gait and his tremors and his brachinesia, and he's able to move in this beautifully fluid way. And this is somewhat significant, and we will return to the issue of the relationship between dance and Parkinson's disease later, towards the end of the paper. But in 2007, Oliver Sacks put forward a very interesting theory about musicality and neurodegenerative diseases. And his idea in that book is that there is a sort of Darwinian innate musicality in the human brain, which is inhibited, but is inhibited in the normal brain, which becomes disinhibited in cases of neurodegeneration, like frontal lobe dementia, or in Parkinson's disease, or in Alzheimer's disease. And that the alterations that take place at a neuromolecular level in the brain in these degenerative diseases lets the music out, lets an innately evolutionary capacity that exists within the human brain, it lets it out. But that view that view held by Sachs is not a universal view at all. It is an extremely marginal view. In the psychobiological, molecular biological construction of the relationship between Parkinson's disease and creativity. And this paper is going to investigate the non-Saxian view, the non-Oliver Sacks view, and it's going to investigate two things really: the development over time of two cultures, or cultural. They're not both discourses. One is really a discourse, one is really a narrative, but two cultural conversations, if you like, around the relationship between Parkinson's disease and creativity. And the one is a psychobiological discourse with the power to affect human consciousness and somatic experience through pharmacological manipulation according to the edicts of its own knowledge. Now, the paper contrasts that with the development of a patient culture around creativity, a set of patient narratives, a patient story about an interpretation of the relationship between Parkinson's disease and creativity. And I want to suggest that there's a historical framing for the emergence of these two cultures, and it's almost a sort of specific moment really, which is the replacement of one etiological paradigm for Parkinson's disease with another, an etiological paradigm that had survived for a number of decades after the Second World War, and that paradigm is called the nigrostriatal dopamine deficiency paradigm of Parkinson's disease, defined as a single nosological entity. That paradigm went along with a nosological definition of Parkinson's disease as primarily a motor disorder. And that paradigm gets exploded through the genomic revolution, in the genomic revolution in the investigation of Parkinson's disease, and with it gets exploded the nosological entity, the single ontological entity of Parkinson's disease. So, historical moment really that frames this story that I'm about to tell is that what I call, I've invented this term myself. It's got nothing to do with Kantian deontology. It's called deontologicalization. I've invented this term. I'm not very good at philosophy really, but anyway, it's what I call a deontologicalization of Parkinson's disease, and its replacement with ontological emergence. Certainly within neuromolecular biology, the post-1996, the post-genomic revolution in Parkinson's disintegrates the nosological entity of Parkinson's disease into a set of a huge variation of conditions which are identified over a much longer period of the life course. Now, I'm not the person who really said this first. And there's one other thing that I'm going to talk about in the paper, which is that this deontologicalization at the neuromolecular level, with this replacement, and the replacement of that with this material analysis of emergent, of incessant emergence, ontological emergence and transformation, doesn't result in the elimination of analysis in the neuromolecular and clinical analysis of the relationship of Parkinson's disease and creativity. And I want to say that I want to contrast that with the status of ontology in patient narratives, the status of disease ontology in patient narratives surrounding Parkinson's disease. And what I will try and argue in the paper is that in the patient narratives you also have a deontologization of the disease, but on the level of the experience of transformation, of ontology as an emerging process, which facilitates an understanding and an experience of different ways of becoming human, rather than being bounded in humanness, as is characteristic in the philosophical categorization of humanism, of being human as the legacy of Renaissance humanist, the legacy in our culture of Renaissance humanism, or the notion of what it is to be human as an ontological entity. Okay, so I'm not the first person to talk about the importance of the explosion of the etiological paradigm of nigrostriatal dopamine deficiency. In 2008, the Jack Clark Professor in Parkinson's disease at Toronto University, Anthony Lang, was really writing a manifesto saying, we've got to completely throw out our clinical profile of Parkinson's disease. It's completely inappropriate to be treating Parkinson's simply as a motor disorder, because it's basically there is no there anymore. There is no single nosology. There is just an assemblage of conditions which have different proximate relationships to each other, and he accounts for this as this disintegration, this explosion of Parkinson's disease simply as a motor disorder, as a result of the elimination of the nigrostriatal dopamine deficiency paradigm. There's Anthony Lang. Now this is just a little bit. Now the physicians can help me out here. The physicians and scientists can help me out here, because I'm very bad at being able to pronounce the nucleus accumbens, which I don't have it on here actually. But so this basically. So these are the dopaminergic pathways in the brain. There's more than just, and this is the substantia nigra. Victor Zier discovers this in 1772. See, the 18th century history of this is very, very interesting, but I haven't got time to tell you about that. So right here, and this is the up to the striatum. The dopaminergic cells are this melanin, dark melanin-rich area. Here is the dopaminergic cell, the neurons, and their relationship to the striatum is what's involved in motor disorder. And then, but the other one that's important for our talk is this one. Is the dopaminergic cells move from the VTA, this system, and this system is involved in motor disorder, and this system of the dopamine pathway in the brain is involved in reward learning and its pathologization in addiction, and that is going to be an important part of our talk today. Now, the way in which that's the actual construction of this paradigm, the historical construction of this paradigm, is going to take me about 2 chapters, at least 2 chapters in the book, because it's two stories about the history of the discovery and function of the substantia nigra, and then it's also the complex story about the discovery of the function of dopamine. And so the actual critical moment in the establishment of the nigrostriatal dopamine deficiency paradigm for Parkinson's is when Arvid Carlsson, Lund University in 1958, demonstrates the true biological function of dopamine as a catecholamine neurotransmitter. And before that, it had been presumed to be a precursor to the other catecholamine neurotransmitters of epinephrine and epinephrine or adrenaline and noradrenaline. And the story of how he demonstrates this is very fascinating, and it involves the use of neuroleptic pharmacology to make catatonic to make rabbits catatonic, and then to wake them up, reanimate them with big doses of the amino acid dopa. Carlson's got these lovely pictures of the rabbits, like this, and then up with their ears and so forth. But I don't really have time to tell that story today. But I do need to tell you that after Carlsson and his team at Lund University demonstrate the biological function of dopamine, they use new forms of fluorescent chemistry to actually then construct these pathways of the dopamine pathways in the brain. Now, after 1958, nothing happens to this etiological paradigm for about 40 years, and all the research in Parkinson's during this period is into the use of L-DOPA and the development of agonists and other therapeutic agents to control the motor symptoms of the disease. And there is no focus on the behavioral symptoms of the disease, which is significant. Depression and neurodegeneration, cognitive degeneration. And it's in the early 1990s when patient advocate groups start pressurizing the NIH for new research into Parkinson's that address the broader spectrum of symptoms related to the disease, that the neuromolecular biology starts to get funded in the disease for the disease, and the first genomic investigations are undertaken. Now, Robert Nussbaum, my colleague at UCSF, was a young thing in the 1990s. He's still a pretty young thing, but anyway, he was a fellow at the NIH, and he works with Michael I find it very difficult to pronounce Michael's name, but anyway, he works with Michael Peropoulos from New York, Polymelopoulos, at the originally from New York University, at the NIH. He becomes involved with Robert becomes involved with that group, who are investigating a high rate of early onset Parkinson's disease in an Italian American family living in New Jersey. And this family, it's a large kinship family, and a large number of them, abnormal number of them, have early onset Parkinson's disease in their 40s and 50s, and they have less tremor, and they have more stiffness, and have more of the other cogwheel movements, etc. And it's during their so you know what Nussbaum and the group are doing is they're taking up the fashion for the time of doing this, which is to investigate Mendelian forms of well-known degenerative diseases, to see if the genomics and proteomics of the to be found in the Mendelian forms can be applied to analysing the genomic activity in the non-Mendelian, in the non-Mendelian representations of the disease. During this, they quickly, it's pretty easy. The group pretty easily identified the first, the gene responsible for the onset of the disease in the Italian family. SCA eventually becomes known as PARK1, and this gene codes for a protein called alpha-synuclein, and they discover that alpha-synuclein. There's the famous paper that they published in 1996 on this, and discover that it's what was described earlier. There's many. There are a number of copies of the gene which is overproducing the protein. Not that there's a mutation in the gene, and that is a completely new paradigm of synucleinopathy as the basis for Parkinson's disease. But the critical feature of this paradigm is what is taken up by Heiko Braak, who's a professor of neuroanatomy at Johann Wolfgang Goethe University, and he demonstrates that abnormal patterns of alpha-synuclein revealed by new forms of immunostaining in non-catecholaminergic neurons could be categorized in a neuropathological staging system of disease progression, and this transforms the understanding of Parkinson's disease. After the Braak staging system demonstrates that that abnormal alpha-synucleinopathy is occurring much earlier in the life course, much further, way beyond the midbrain and further down in the brain stem. Braak develops a much longer staging of the development of the disease, much longer period of time, and with eventually conditions which affect the transformations that are taking place in the brain. And what that does, what the Braak staging and the synucleinopathy paradigm based on the Braak staging system does, is that it does what Nussbaum identified right at the beginning when he started his research, was it explodes the idea of Parkinson's simply as a motor disorder, and the behavioral symptoms of Parkinson's disease become a much more powerful focus of research. So what emerges after? It's very nice to have the accompaniment of the bells, but I'm sure that I can compete with them. I hope it doesn't distract us too much from our serious work. Anyway, so the behavioral paradigm of Parkinson's since the 1990s has not really, though, dissembled. It's disrupted the single nosological entity of Parkinson's disease. It didn't dissemble a dopaminergic deterministic model of Parkinson's disease, enhanced it, and supported, I would argue, an increasingly pervasive epistemology of the dopaminergic brain. Now, I would have to give you another paper to support that historical thesis about the emergence of the dopaminergic brain, but I'll just say it for now and illustrate it with some of the things I'm going to say later. How long does it go on for, the bells, do you think? I hear the bells. Yes. Oh, good. Excellent. Okay, so with the new behavioral assemblage of Parkinson's disease, a new space is opened up for the relationship between the dopaminergic basis to the changes that take place in the dopaminergic anatomy and function within the brain, and the Parkinsonian personality. So Parkinson behaviors and Parkinson personality. So there's a new space opened up for the reinterpretation of a biobehavioral model of Parkinson's disease, which is linked to a biobehavioral model of the relation based on the analysis of dopaminergic activity in the brain of cognition and creativity. And a critical feature of that, a critical feature of this new biobehavioral model of the dopaminergic brain and Parkinson's disease and the relationship between Parkinson's and creativity is dramatically affected by the development of the tri-dimensional psychobiological temperament system developed in the 1980s and 1990s by, as I describe him, the Kantian transcendentalist philosopher, professor of psychiatry at Washington University, Claude Robert Cloninger. And Cloninger, I call him he's absolutely preoccupied with Kant, Claude Cloninger. For somebody who deals entirely in, and he's to the extent that he's now, his most recent theories are a sort of the dopaminergic basis of not just of creativity, but of spirituality, which he thinks is the highest form of human experience. He's got a big hierarchy, as you will see, about human experience. Anyway, in what he called a unified social theory of personality in 1986, Claude Cloninger argued that heritable personality traits of novelty-seeking, harm avoidance, and reward dependence were correlated with dopaminergic activity in the basal ganglia, serotonergic activity, and basal noradrenergic activity. He developed a tri-dimensional temperament system as a new methodological and epistemological framework in which genomic analysis could be correlated with personality and cognitive analysis. By the end of the 1990s, he codified this psychobiological model in a tri-dimensional personality questionnaire and in a tri-dimensional character inventory. And these tools provided the neurobiology of cognition and character with a new methodological framework of investigation, and it becomes absolutely pervasive. The use of these tools, in the 1990s, they get adapted and changed in different, you get the Dutch version, which changes it a little bit, and it gets changed and modified in different research contexts, but it becomes the pervasive method for trying to correlate, score personality traits with, to correlate scores of personality traits with the analysis of variability in dopaminergic activity in the brain. So this tool becomes a central mechanism for models of cognition and the subset of cognition, creativity. And it's been utilized to produce, to hunt for the genes that are the genes which are involved in dopaminergic function and activity as the basic molecular determinants of cognitive variability. And these are the genes that have been these are the most prominent candidate genes for dopaminergic codifying genes that are currently the most prominent candidates as critical to cognition. And some of this analysis has, it's very heavily of course, and has got to the stage now where there are some research groups which are claiming an extensive amount of predictability from some of these analyses. For example, Sapra, Bevin and Zach from Claremont University and Loma Linda Medical School in California last year in a PLOS article claimed they had found the gene combo, the dopaminergic gene combo that produces successful 1% careers in their article in PLOS called, I quote, "A combination of dopamine genes predicts success by professional Wall Street traders." So, that's the extent to which this research is developing. Now, apart from facilitating the genomic investigation of heritable cognitive creativity and cognitive variation and creativity, the Cloninger tridimensional personality and character system has also been utilized in the genetic investigation into emotional variation. In particular, the psychobiological charting of dopaminergic pathways in personality traits of reward learning, novelty seeking, and pathological addiction. And this has had emphatic influence on the neuromolecular construction of a pre-morbid predictive Parkinson patient personality. Now, in 1913, there's been, the idea that there's a Parkinson's personality there's a long history to this, and it sort of starts with Carl Camp in 1913. He was a clinical professor in nervous diseases at the University of Michigan, and on the basis of his anecdotal, just his, clinical anecdotal observations, really, that he thought that Parkinson's patients had a kind of, personality profile, if you like, that they were, they were very steady, and they didn't drink or smoke, and they were, very cautious, and they were very well managed. In Carl Dudley Camp's view, these are admirable, the traits of the classic kind of classic respectability in Carl Dudley Camp's conception of them. Now, as I say, it was just based on anecdotal ideas, really. There was no research that Camp based his ideas upon. But 100 years of psychobiology have subsequently characterized Parkinson's patients as possessing distinctive personality traits of industriousness, seriousness, and inflexibility. And the Cloninger tridimensional character framework has rescripted this clinical anecdotal epistemological system profoundly, because the DPQ and the DCI have become the major tools for investigating a pre-morbid Parkinson's personality as a predictive device, not only for determining predilection to the onset of motor dysfunction, but of progressive cognitive and behavioral transformation. I'm not going to go into all the research that's actually achieved this through the 1990s, because that would really take up a lot of time. But throughout the 1990s, the DPQ and the DCI were used to construct, to quantitatively try to measure personality traits that could predict the onset, that characterized the profile of the Parkinson personality, and could be used to predict its onset. And these are the personality traits that emerge from the research in the 1990s. So Parkinson's patients are low novelty seeking, they're dullards, they're apathetic, they're stoic, they're slow tempered, they're frugal, persistent, and they're fearful. They're harm avoiding. So this is the profile of the personality, the Parkinson's personality that emerges out of this psychobiological research, facilitated by this analysis of cognition using the behavioral tool, the Cloninger behavioral tools to measure differential dopaminergic variability in the brain. So all of these characteristics are defined dopaminergically, right, and correlated with behavioral scores. So, as the historian, you could say poor Parkinson's patients, because under the neuromolecular biopsychological gaze, the PD patients are now dogged by dopamine, never to be released. As the historian Genevieve has pointed out, the neurological patient has been studied and documented extensively through visual media. And the Parkinson's patient has been clinically visualized from Charcot's drawings. Remember, Charcot is the person who calls paralysis, the shaking palsy, after Parkinson's, after James Parkinson. He named the disease in 1866, and he's preoccupied. He does a lot of work on Parkinson's disease, but he's preoccupied with the retropulsive of Parkinson's patients, and characterized them and characterized his studies a lot in drawings that either he or usually his students did. So the Parkinson's patient has been extensively visually represented from Charcot onwards, but perhaps the most emblematic representation, visual representation of the Parkinson's patient is the Paul Richer, Charcot's collaborator, Paul Richer, his figurine that's produced in and the Richer image is an archetype of somatic degeneration, vividly sculpted in the imagination. The stigmata, pitiful objectification, broken, inescapably overwhelming. Dopaminergic molecular psychogazing now prescribes inevitable destiny upon Richer's pitiful object. According to the dopaminergic neuropsychological gaze, Richer's figure was born to be in dopaminergically coded inflexibility. So, according to this neuromolecular biopsychological theory, when genetically predisposed dullard Parkinson's personalities demonstrate creativity, it is a pathological symptom. According to a body of neurobiological and clinical observations articulated over the last 2 decades, creativity in Parkinson's patients is another form of pathological disability. 2001, Annette Schrag and Trimble from University College London reported what they believed to be the first case of poetic talent being unmasked by dopamine agonist treatment for Parkinson's. Their patient was aged 40 when he was first diagnosed, with a tremor in his left hand, dragging of his left leg, and dystonia of the left foot. As symptoms increased, the patient started treatment with the dopamine agonist lisuride and levodopa at age 44. His symptoms significantly improved, and within the first month of treatment, he began writing poetry for the first time in his life, completing 10 poems in the first year of treatment. His poems achieved significant publishing success, and he won a prize in the annual contest of the International Association of Poets. The patient had always considered himself intellectually inferior to his siblings and family generally, never having achieved an equivalent level of academic success. He did, however, have a maternal grandfather who was a published poet, and he was related to a well-known Irish poet. No other changes occurred until after 12 years of treatment, the patient began to show symptoms of depression, aggressive and volatile behavior, along with grandiose ideas, paranoid delusions, extreme circumstantiality. That means talking around the houses and not getting to the point, a bit like I'm doing now, over-talkativeness and pressured speech. After various therapeutic adjustments, the patient returned to a stable emotional and cognitive state and sustained control of motor symptoms. Now, throughout this period and to the end of his life, the patient continued to write and publish his poetry. And Schrag and Trimble explored a wide range of possible explanations for their poet unmasked, including contradictory implications of the classic pre-morbid PD personality, but they found no explanation really satisfying. They speculate, that the effects of the drugs produce a sort of hypomanic syndrome with, in addition to selective frontocortical dysfunction, and led to the release of previously inhibited creative power in the patient. So this is a kind of Oliver Sacks type of theory, right? So it's letting the inhibition out. An innate, it's disinhibiting an innate talent. But now, but Schrag and Trimble's view was a sort of tentative, speculative view that their patient's poetry was a sort of hypomanic high. So if that's their view at the beginning of the 2000s, a much more reductive neuropsychological explanation was being offered by analysts of Parkinson's disease visual art. In 2005, Ruth Walker and colleagues at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in New York and New York Medical School of Medicine described a patient who had possessed a pre-morbid, undeveloped, had already possessed artistic tendencies before they were diagnosed for sketching, but that this tendency dramatically changed after beginning dopamine agonist therapy. At this point, he started to produce several pastel drawings a week, sometimes 2 a day. After moving to an assisted living facility, he had even more time to devote to his art, but at the same time began to show hypersexual disinhibition in what they did as excessive flirting, women on the street, asking residents and staff of his assisted living facility pose nude for his artwork. His disinhibition became controlled following what they describe as an education, and his artwork began to be shown and sold in local galleries in the Bronx. Now, in contrast to Schrag and Trimble, Walker et al. Described their patients' artistic productivity as a pathological symptom of compulsive disorder, equivalent to pathological gambling and hypersexuality associated with excessive dopamine stimulation. Thus, the Walker team identified their patients' creativity as the result of overstimulation of the third dopaminergic pathway in the brain, which I brought your attention to earlier, which is responsible for reward learning that can become pathologically transformed into addiction. Now, the Walker theory did not go uncontested. In 2006, Anjan Chatterjee and colleagues from the University of Pennsylvania were far more reluctant than the Walker team to reduce their patient, who they call CSD, to reduce their patient's art to the ravages of PD, even after considering the pros and cons of defining it as a compulsive obsessive disorder. CSD, the Chatterjee's team patient, was a 68-year-old graphic designer whose motor symptoms had progressed over 15 years from 1992, while his agonist and levodopa medications had been adjusted to compensate. A psychologist encouraged CSD to start painting as a therapeutic activity to relieve his depression in 2002. While initially producing work derivative of Van Gogh, within a year he had begun producing uniquely original, vibrant colored pencil abstract works using fine regular lines. What's more, he used his right hand, in which his resting tremor was so severe that he found it very, very difficult to write, but his artistic work used large amplitude proximal movements, reaching rather than distal movements used in writing and grasping, that allowed him to feel, I quote, a sense of bursting forth and tearing back water. CSD he talked about the urgency to produce and utilize sleep deprivation, which is a common symptom of PD, he discussed his urgency to paint. But his explanation is completely contrasting to Walker explanation of hectic compulsion. CSD's explanation of his urgency is that the train has left the station, I have just been served a delicious dinner in the cafe car, and the train is picking up speed, so I have to eat fast so I can finish my meal before we get to the last stop and I have to get off. He wants to do as much of this as possible before he has to leave the train. By the end of the decade, however, the Chatterjee team and the Schrag and Trimble's reticent interpretations of their patients' artistic absolutely overwhelmed by a neuropsychomolecular diagnosis of Parkinson's, patients which define creativity as a disabling pathology resulting from excessive dopamine levels in the VTA pathway, producing addictive behavior. I have to start shouting. Okay, competing with the bells. I have to say that's a first. I've never actually done that before. Anyway, I'm going to give you one example. I could give you many, many examples of the build-up of the clinical literature that describing Parkinson's, Parkinson art as a form of addiction. But I'll use one to illustrate the consequences of this diagnosis, of this definition and this categorization, this pathological categorization of creativity. It's a very interesting one. It's produced by a group based in the University of Barcelona, led by Jaime Kuleveski. And it exemplifies this diagnostic model of Parkinson's to creativity as a form of addiction. In 2009, the Kuleveski team were aware of the earlier reports by Walker and Schrag and Chatterjee, but in the case they reported, their patient was a 47-year-old amateur painter before being diagnosed with PD, whose interests in art diminished after he was first medicated and became depressed with mild apathy. He retired from his employment and nothing changed in his behavioral profile until 2 years later when the dopamine agonist cabergoline was added to his levodopa treatment. His motor symptoms significantly improved and he began painting again, but with a dramatically changed attitude toward his artistic endeavor. Prior to PD, he took months to complete a painting, and his work was detailed and figurative and focused on accurately depicting reality. Now he started to produce one painting a week, and his paintings grew more and more impressionistic, emphasizing color and light rather than detail. The patient explained the change as a need to, I quote, express my refreshed emotions. Within 9 months, he painted every day and started showing and selling his work in local galleries in Barcelona. Now, the Kuleveski team focused on, they didn't focus on the fact that he was now actually earning a living as an artist. They focused instead on what they perceived as a degeneration into addiction, as their patient began to continue painting through the night, and his work pattern became disruptive to his family, who complained to the team and asked them to do something about it. They considered that the dysphoric response of the patient himself to suggestions that he should stop painting was a symptom. That was a symptom of his addiction. It was a symptom of his addiction to the activity. Like trying to say to they thought they would, suggesting that he shouldn't paint anymore. They thought his response was the equivalent of a heroin addict saying, you mustn't get high anymore. So the patient regarded his artwork as the patient's explanation was, it's positive for me because it enables me to move more easily and allows me to feel, I quote, emotionally relieved. The Kuleveski team noted that no other behavioral changes occurred, such as hypersexuality or dopamine dysregulation syndrome or other impulsive behaviors. But because they considered the patient's artistic focus disruptive to his family, the team withdrew the cabergoline over a period of 6 weeks, during which the patient noticeably decreased his arc and became increasingly apathetic and depressed. They then increased the levodopa, but the patient did not resume painting. Then decided to institute the agonist therapy at 4 mg, and their patient began immediately painting again with the same intensity. They reduced the agonist. They then reduced his agonist treatment of 2 milligrams a day, and he stopped painting at night. He continued to paint, but he stopped painting at night. And the clinical team believed they'd finally got the right therapy to manage what they interpreted as continuous dopaminergic stimulation through dopamine agonists, producing a pathological usurpation of the neural mechanisms of creativity. Now, using artistic creativity production as a measure of impulsive predisposition in Parkinson's patients has now become standard methodology. Artistic work, redefined in the Cloninger system as a novelty-seeking category, has become firmly located within the dopaminergic pathway of addiction. Okay, so that's the molecular biological discourse as it's built up, especially over the last decade, to interpret the relationship between creativity and Parkinson's disease. But it's extremely contrasting to the narratives, or the patient narrative, that's emerged over the same period. Parkinson's patients describe the impact upon their of illness upon their creativity in terms of its humanistic meaning to them, rather than its biological, rather than its definition as a form of biologically encoded metaphysicality. Joan Vermette exhibited her paintings in an exhibition of Parkinson's disease Parkinson's patients' art and writing mounted at the McGill Center for Studies in Montreal in 2001. Vermette was diagnosed with PD in her late 30s. She is a professional artist, she is a mother, and she is a physician. She believed that her painting style became enhanced since her diagnosis. Because the new style is less precise but more vibrant, I have a need to express myself more. I let myself go, sometimes painting with enraged fingers. Vermette is familiar with the theoretical view about the influence of her medication on her imagination, but she doesn't care. She perceives her practice of painting through the night as a way to manage the chronic insomnia that accompanies Parkinson's disease, and it allows her time while her children sleep. Vermette sums up the experience of enhanced creativity as, I quote, "When I paint, I'm in the best place because I am only doing that. There's no planning, there's no hierarchy of actions, just the urgency of living." Urgency to paint for Vermette is not characterized as a compulsive, hectic compulsive addiction, but rather as a calming release. Similarly, in contrast to creativity as defined as pathologically hectic, the hematologist Parkinson's patient Gwendolyn Spurl at McGill University argues that artistic expression has given her a new Zen-like quality in her life, including in her clinical practice, which is often commented on by patients. Spurl began painting in 2003 prior to her PD diagnosis, when she focused on expressing the desolation she had felt during a period of her life 20 years earlier while she was struggling with infertility. Following her diagnosis of PD in 2005, she started to focus on the dialectics of joy and dismay. That's how she describes this series of paintings, begun with this one, as paintings on the dialectics of joy and dismay. Dismay that her Parkinson's will one day force her to end her clinical career and probably force her to leave her home. That's what the storm is about. And joy that she will be at least able to continue to paint, probably throughout the duration of her degenerative condition. Does painting affect my practice as a physician? Sperl asks. I think so. My patients often describe my bedside manner as calm and even zen. Sperl accounts for this as a sort of transference of her own experience in sitting down with a blank canvas and starting to paint. For her it induces, I quote, a calm state in my mind that removes me from the imperfections of my life, and it convinces me that patients likewise can accept whatever confronts them. Apparently this conviction is communicated to my patients through my calmness. Sperl reflects on the relationship of the onset of Parkinson's and the emergence of her creative interest in painting. Citing Sachs' discussion of the disruption of self-expression, the disruption of self-expression inhibition in neurological patients with frontal lobe lesions and such as frontal lobe dementia, she ponders whether this effect, noted in Parkinson's patients, may also be happening to herself. What does this mean? She says, I don't know. What she does know is that painting, I quote, induces a flow state and removes from my consciousness the constant knowledge of my physical limitations. It is like medication. It is my zen. But for Alan Babbitt, the relationship between his disease and his creativity has nothing to do with therapeutics. It became an opportunity in much the same way as Henry Matisse 100 years earlier had described the impact of illness upon his life, upon his artistic life world. For Babbitt, PD stimulated the creation of an entirely new artistic genre which he calls Tremor-enhanced photography. This is Alan Babbitt. Alan Babbitt has been a locally renowned San Francisco Bay Area artist since the 1970s, and his initial interest in photography stemmed from the transformative visual experience it gave him having impaired vision from albinism, nystagmus, lazy eye, and profound myopia from his early childhood. His mother and father gave him a Brownie Hawkeye camera at the age of 7. For the first time, he could see details close up. Describes something far more profound, however, than just being liberated from his myopia, I quote. But then I discovered I could use it, photography, to see things people with vision couldn't. Now that was satisfying. Turns out, the truth is, when it comes to photography, how well you see has only a little to do with how well you see. Babbitt makes fun of his addiction to photography, admitting to becoming shamelessly high on it, breaking trespass laws and getting a paper round in order to feed his habit. When the movement disorders of Parkinson's disease began to appear in 2003, however, for the first time, he says, darkness filled my viewfinder. He lost interest in photography, rarely venturing out to shoot and bored with the results. Then one night, he's on the Las Vegas Strip, of all places, he says, in disbelief, and I began to see them. I began to let the tremor have its way as I clicked the shutter. The experience was, he describes, whoa. The visual gumbo of flashing lights, multi-tinted neon, and watery reflections became wonderful smears, blurs, streaks. Now this was fun, Babbitt says. Beyond the sheer exuberance of the work, Babbitt describes an epistemological shift of understanding photography that's resulted from his Parkinson's disease diagnosis. Liberated from the photo dogma of stillness and sharpness, I've experienced a rush of creative freedom like never before. Rules, who needs rules? Babbitt puts it this way: the damn disease has given me a terrific gift. Okay, so in conclusion, what I've tried to demonstrate is that history supports Anthony Lang's thesis about the explosion of the nigrostriatal deficiency paradigm and the disintegration of motor disorder centrality in Parkinson's disease. Since the 1990s, the molecular and genomic pathways in Parkinson's has dispersed a fixed ontological entity into an emergent ontology of interactions in an incessant state of flux. The ontology of Parkinson's has scattered into a temporality of dialectical emergence without teleological resolution. Emergent ontology, however, has not impacted the stigmatization function of neuromolecular gazing in Parkinson's. Even if Lang wants us to believe there is no there, a new epoch of clinical Parkinson's is already upon us. His proposition that with the disintegration of the nigrostriatal dopamine deficiency paradigm, a new era of non-dopaminergic Parkinson's is emerging is contradicted in the emergent ontological neuromolecular era of the non-disease. While the dominance of the dopamine deficiency model has been deconstructed, the dopaminergic characterization of the Parkinson's patient remains profoundly robust. Indeed, as dopamine deficiency and motor disorder lost centrality, the dopaminergic construction of Parkinson's as a behavioral and cognitive identity has become increasingly entrenched and fossilized. To a degree, this is only a thematic substratum of the historical emergence of a pervasive neuromolecular theory of the dopaminergic brain, mind, and behavior in neurobiological psychiatry, which, as I say, would be the subject of another paper. But the neuromolecular dopaminergic assemblage of Parkinson's disability, personality, and contingent creativity has been my focus here. Here, a genetically determined dullard has defined the pre-morbid Parkinson's patient personality using Cloninger and subsequent derivations of the tridimensional temporal system. Predisposed low creativity paradigm of the Parkinson's personality is disrupted by artistic expression in patients, redefined neuromolecular as a pathological symptom of excessive dopamine stimulation and addiction. The neuromolecular characterization of the relationship between creativity and Parkinson's patients, however, has a counterculture represented in the discourses articulated by patients of their experiences. In patient narratives, replacing ontological stasis with emergence changes the relationship between embodiment and becoming. As a result, sufferers have dispersed the materiality of disability by creating the meaning of shifting embodiments for themselves and others. For example, by engaging, expressing, and disseminating the dialectics of dread and subliminal exquisiteness through artistic work, unfolding the consequences of the misfolding proteins that are causing their degenerative physical change. And if the meaning of disablement is disembodied, then the essentialism of stigma, including the stigma of objectified pity, might also be undermined. In the Parkinson's patients' accounts of their experience of creativity, the disability theorist Paul Longmore's vision of a new epistemology of ability becomes a possibility. For Parkinson's patients engaged in creative artistic work, the essentialist concept of disability disappears into limitless opportunities for creating meaning, not out of being, but out of incessantly becoming human. And here perhaps the contemporary focus of post-humanist theory on emergent ontology may be of interpretive value for us. If post-humanist theory has any value for interpreting the history of Parkinson's disease, it is that it interrogates the stifling, suffocating stability of the conceptualization of humanness in humanism, or in the legacy of the humanist philosophy. If troubling ontology with emergent becoming can disrupt cultural assumptions regarding Parkinson's disease, then perhaps such ideational shifts can impact the clinical encounter in which it is defined and managed. Perhaps undermining cultural essentialisms and scientific reductionism might lend legitimacy to a broader, expansive therapeutic creativity. In such a self-reflective clinical imaginary, counterintuitive therapeutics may garner less ridicule and gain more traction, such as encouraging people with motor disorders to dance. Or, as is most recently, as in Leonard Lowe, in Awakenings, of course, dancing his way out of his Parkinson's symptoms. Only more recently, in the clinical literature that's exploring the whole role of dance as a therapeutic intervention for Parkinson's disease, the literature has started to focus on the tango as as the the newest and most innovative possibility for curing gates. Thank you very much.